Welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program, but unlike many political programs, we don't address the pressing issues of the day. We don't take sides on issues. We're a nonpartisan show. The purpose of None of the Above is to talk about how our political system has become so dysfunctional and so polarized, and to talk about solutions to help diminish the polarization and diminish the dysfunction in our system. In our last show, we started a two-part segment on redistricting. Redistricting reminds me of that medical phrase where they talk about something being the silent killer. I think redistricting is the silent killer of the political system because it so skews the results. We've had guests on shows talking about how there's very few contested seats these days, how the action's in the primaries, and a lot of that is due to redistricting and the impact of redistricting and the skewing of elections and ballot access and who's running for office through redistricting. So in the first segment, we had Professor Jackson from the Paul Simon Institute at the Southern Illinois University. And we started our conversation to talk about why redistricting is having the impact it is having on the system. And today we're going to revisit with Professor Jackson, and we're going to talk about some solution sets that are out there. And then in the back half of the program, we're going to interview with a political action campaign that's taking place in Illinois that's directed to solving the problem in Illinois. Many states have looked at solving the problem. Many states are getting aggressive on solving the problem. We're going to talk about specifically what Illinois is doing to focus on that problem. Before we get to Professor Jackson, I thought we should put in context some of the stuff we talked about in the last program and some of the stuff that we will talk about today. And I've got the whiteboard with me, as I often do. It's a very complicated whiteboard today, so I hope you'll be patient, and we're going to walk our way through it. And when we're done with that, hopefully all of you will have a much better understanding of how this redistricting plays out in the actual election campaigns and in the actual elections. So this particular whiteboard is divided up into sections on the number of votes that were cast, and in this case, the number of votes that were cast during the elections in 2012. And then the other data set are the seats held. In other words, what seats were won in the election. And we're talking about strictly Democrats versus Republicans here. And in this case, the seats that were held in 2013. So the election was 2012. People were inaugurated, sworn in to their seats in 2013. And we're going to look at three separate states. We're going to look at Illinois, which is a demonstrably Democratic state, Indiana, which is a demonstrably Republican state, and Minnesota, which is a state that has a special judicial panel that was in place for their redistricting effort that led to the elections in 2012 and the results in 2013. So we've got three different segments of redistricting, one skewed Democrat, one skewed Republican, and one arguably skewed to neutral. Can you skew to neutral? I don't know. One neutral. So let's look at Illinois. The first column is going to be the vote column, and that's going to be the percentage of the vote. So again, the percentage of the vote. And then the S column is going to be the number of seats held, and that's also going to be a percentage. So if a state had 100 seats in its legislature and half of them were held by Democrats, the number on the board here would be 50 because they had 50%. So let's walk through Illinois and see what happened in a particularly blue state. So the first column here is going to be the congressional election column. C for congressional election. The second column is going to be for state senate. The third column will be for state house, and then it will repeat itself. And I've got red numbers for the Republican numbers and blue numbers for the Democratic numbers. So let's drill down to Illinois. We've got the congressional elections, and 44% of the vote in Illinois was for Republicans trying to elect congressional members. So 44% of all the congressional vote in Illinois was Republican. Yet, there are only 33% of the congressional seats from Illinois are held by Republicans. So you see that 44% of the vote only produced 33% of the seats. Let's drop down here to the Democratic column in Illinois. 55% of the vote went to Democratic congressional candidates. Yet 67% of the congressional seats are held by Democrats. So 44% of the vote Republican, 55% of the vote Democrat, yet 1/3 of the seats only for Republicans and 2/3 for Democrats. So you see the role that redistricting plays. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that with a 44 to 55 split that you would have 44% to 55%. There's so many other variables that go into this that you can't explain everything with statistics. But here they're so skewed that I think it tells a story. So let's look quickly at the state legislature. The Republicans produce 46% of the votes for the state Senate, but only have 32% of the seats. 48% of the vote for the state House, but only have 40% of the seats. Conversely, the Democrats produce 54% of the votes for the state Senate and have a whopping 68% of the seats. In fact, I think the Democrats in Illinois have the largest voting margin of all state senates that there are in the United States. I have that back in my mind. There might be an exception for Hawaii, but that's a pretty skewed state. And the state House, 52% of the vote were for Democrats. It's 60% of the votes, 60% of the seats, rather, are held by Democrats. So you can see how the results are totally skewed in Illinois. And again, this is a Democratic state, and the seats are skewed towards Democrats. We won't go through all the numbers in Indiana, but Indiana, again, is more of a Republican state, and it's skewed the other way around. So in Indiana, 53% of the votes were for Republicans running for Congress. Yet 78% of the seats, of the congressional seats in Indiana, are held by Republicans. The converse, of course, is Democrats produce 45% of the votes for congressional seats, and they have 22% of the congressional seats in Indiana. So this shows you the power of redistricting. In Illinois, the Democrats control the redistricting process, and they have totally skewed the results, or the results are totally skewed based upon the maps that were drawn. And in Indiana, it's the reverse. So now let's look at a state that, again, in Minnesota, was drawn by a special judicial panel. Let's look at the outcome in a state where arguably the map should be more competitive. Here you had 43% of the votes for Congress being voted for Republicans and 56% of the vote for Democrats. Well, the 43% yielded 38% of the congressional seats, and here the 56% yielded 62. So it's a little bit skewed, but not to the degree that you're seeing in these other states. Look at this vote here. The Democrats produce 56% of the votes for the state Senate and hold 58% of the state Senate seats. The Republicans produce 44% of the votes for the state Senate, hold 42% of the state Senate seats. Again, I'm not a student of redistricting in Minnesota, but I think you get a sense that when you do have an independent panel, in this case a special judicial panel, you might have a map that will produce a much more competitive election and a much more balanced legislature in this case. The last set of numbers here I threw up are the national numbers. Now the national numbers are affected by the fact that there's not one national map drawn. Each state draws its own map. And in the last redistricting cycle, the Republicans controlled more states for redistricting. So you would expect in Congress Republicans to control the House of Representatives, which is the case. So Republicans nationwide produced 48% of the vote in 2012, and they have 54% of the seats. The Democrats produced 59% of the votes for Congress and have 46% of the seats. Not as skewed as what you have in Illinois and Indiana, but certainly skewed, and again, a result of this phenomenon that we're calling redistricting and the impact it's going to have not just on dysfunction, but particularly on polarization. It's really the redistricting that is driving the polarization that we have and driving the element of the general election not being competitive and all the action being in the primaries.